What is the price of a human life? Is it a number that can be entered into a spreadsheet, a variable in a cold equation of risk versus reward? We want to believe the answer is no. We want to believe that some things are sacred beyond calculation. But what if they are not? What if inside the gleaming towers of modern industry a different kind of math is being done? A math that weighs the cost of a simple metal part against the value of a person's last terrified moments. This is a story about that math. It is the story of a car, a small, unassuming vehicle meant to give freedom to millions, but it became something else entirely. A four-wheeled tomb, a monument to a decision to let people burn. The Ford Pinto was not born of malice, but of fear. In the late 1960s, the American automotive giants felt the ground shifting beneath them. From across the Pacific and the Atlantic, a new kind of vehicle was arriving on their shores. Small, efficient, and cheap cars from Japan and Germany, like the Toyota Corolla and the Volkswagen Beetle, were capturing the hearts and wallets of a new generation of American buyers. For the Ford Motor Company, a titan built on the paradigm of big, powerful, and profitable machines, this was an existential threat. The fortress was being breached. At the helm of this corporate empire, or at least its most visible division, was Lee Iacocca. He was not a man given to idle contemplation or graceful retreat. He was a force of nature, a charismatic and brutally effective executive who saw the market as a battlefield. He saw the import invasion not as a trend, but as a declaration of war. His response was swift and absolute. Ford would fight back. It would build its own small car, and it would do it faster and cheaper than anyone thought possible. The command went out, echoing through the halls of Dearborn, Michigan with the force of a decree. The project was given a name, the Pinto. The marching orders were simple, stark, and non-negotiable. The car had to weigh less than 2,000 pounds, and it had to sell for less than $2,000. The rule of 2000s became a sacred text. But even more demanding was the timeline. A typical car from conception to showroom floor took about 43 months to develop. Iacocca demanded the Pinto be ready in 25. It was an unprecedented, almost impossible schedule. It meant that tooling for the factory assembly lines would have to be developed at the same time as the car's design, not after. Once a design choice was made and the machinery was being built, changing it would be astronomically expensive and time-consuming. The die was cast before the mold was even finished. The chosen location for this nightmare was not a secluded barn or a dark alley, but the brightly lit engineering labs and drafting rooms of the Ford Motor Company. Here, under immense pressure, designers and engineers scrambled to meet Iacocca's mandate. They took an existing platform, the Ford Maverick, and shortened it. They selected components with a ruthless focus on cost. Every penny, every ounce was scrutinized. And in this frantic race against the clock and the budget, they made a fateful decision about where to place the fuel tank. It was nestled low in the rear of the car, behind the rear axle and just in front of the bumper. This was not an unusual placement for the era, but the Pinto's specific geometry created a uniquely dangerous environment. The space was cramped. The fuel tank was separated from the sharp, protruding bolts of the differential housing by a mere 9 inches. The fuel filler neck was poorly designed, prone to being torn away in a collision, creating a ready-made escape route for gasoline. The tank itself was a simple, unreinforced steel box. It was the cheapest and quickest solution. It was also a death trap. The first signs of the pathology appeared early in the confidential silence of Ford's own crash test facilities. Long before the first Pinto was sold to an unsuspecting family, Ford's engineers were ramming prototypes from behind. The results were consistent and horrifying. In crash tests at speeds as low as 21 miles per hour, the rear end would crumple like an accordion. The fuel tank forced forward would be impaled on the differential bolts or crushed against the rear axle housing. It would rupture. Gasoline would pour onto the road and into the passenger compartment. In a world of sparks from scraping metal, the result was a predictable, explosive inferno. These were not secrets hidden from the company, they were data points, recorded in internal reports complete with photographs of the charred, mangled test vehicles. The engineers knew. They proposed solutions. A simple plastic baffle costing about $1 could be installed between the axle and the tank to deflect it. Reinforcing the tank with a rubber bladder, a technology used in race cars, would cost $5 to $8 per vehicle. Moving the tank to a safer position above the rear axle would cost around $11. These were tiny sums, even in the currency of the 1970s. But the Pinto project was not a normal project. It was a crusade, governed by the iron will of Iacocca and the unbending rule of 2000s. The enabling conditions were a perfect storm of corporate culture and regulatory failure. The pressure to meet the deadline meant that safety testing was happening concurrently with production tooling. To go back and implement the $11 fix would mean a delay. It would mean admitting failure. It would mean challenging the wisdom of men like Lee Iacocca. Within the hierarchical, top-down culture of Ford, this was career suicide. Furthermore, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, or NHTSA, was a young agency. Its safety standards were still being formulated. At the time, there was no federal standard for how a car must perform in a rear-end collision. Ford was technically breaking no laws. They were only violating a moral contract with their future customers, a contract that said a company would not knowingly sell a product it knew to be deadly. The pattern, once established, became the operational blueprint. The decision to ignore the initial crash test data was not a one-time oversight. It was reaffirmed again and again at every level of the development process. As the Pinto moved from prototype to mass production, the knowledge of the fatal flaw was carried along with it. A hidden passenger in every single car that rolled off the assembly line. The system of production became a system of proliferation, spreading this latent defect across the highways of America. The escalation from a known flaw to an accepted risk was codified in the machinery of corporate bureaucracy. The horror was laundered through the language of business. The most infamous piece of this machinery was an internal Ford document, a cost-benefit analysis that looked at the issue of fuel tank fires not just in the Pinto but across their entire fleet. It was a document that would later become known simply as the Pinto memo. It is one of the most chilling artifacts in the history of modern capitalism. The memo did not use words like human being or family. It used clinical, sterile terms. It estimated the likely number of future incidents, 180 burn deaths, 180 serious burn injuries, and 2,100 burned vehicles. Then it assigned a monetary value to each. The figures were based on numbers from the NHTSA. A human life was valued at $200,000. A serious burn injury was valued at $67,000. The cost of a burned-out car was $700. The memo's author multiplied the numbers. The total societal cost of these future deaths and injuries was calculated to be $49.5 million. Then the memo calculated the other side of the ledger. The cost of fixing the problem, the cost of installing a safer gas tank at $11 per part across 12.5 million cars and light trucks. The total came to $137 million. The conclusion was as simple as it was monstrous. 137 million is more than 49.5 million. Therefore, from a purely financial perspective, it was not profitable to make the fix. The company would be better off letting those 180 people die, letting another 180 be maimed, and then paying out the relatively small sums for the inevitable lawsuits and insurance claims. It was cheaper to let them burn. The psychological landscape that allowed for such a calculation is a study in compartmentalization. The engineers who ran the tests and saw the fires were not evil men. The managers who read the reports and filed them away likely saw themselves as good family men. The executives who signed off on the final design were pillars of their community. But the corporate structure was designed to diffuse responsibility. The engineer could say he was just following orders. The manager could say he was just passing along the data. The executive could say he was making a tough but necessary business decision to keep the company competitive and save jobs. No single person had to feel the full weight of the choice. The decision belonged to the company, an abstract entity with a balance sheet but no conscience. This diffusion of guilt was aided by a sanitized vocabulary. People weren't incinerated in fiery crashes. The company logged post-collision fuel-fed fires. Victims weren't screaming in agony. They were part of a statistical projection of burn injuries. This bureaucratic language created a sterile buffer between the air-conditioned boardrooms of Dearborn and the hellish reality of a roadside fire. It allowed educated, civilized people to participate in a system that produced predictable, horrific death, all while maintaining their own self-image as responsible professionals. There were moments when the truth almost surfaced, tragic near misses in the historical record. Internal safety reports that recommended changes were buried under the weight of production deadlines. Engineers who may have harbored deep reservations were silenced by the corporate hierarchy. In one instance, Ford even spent millions lobbying against a stronger federal safety standard for fuel tanks that had been proposed by the NHTSA. They successfully delayed the implementation of the new, tougher standard for years. Every memo that was ignored, every safety advocate who was dismissed, every lobbying dollar that was spent to delay regulation represented another layer of dirt shoveled onto the graves of future victims. The company was not just failing to act, it was actively working to ensure its dangerous design remained legal. The zenith of the horror began in 1971 when the Ford Pinto officially hit the market. It was an instant, spectacular success. With its peppy styling and its magic price point under $2,000, America fell in love. Ford sold over 3 million Pintos between 1971 and 1980. It was hailed as Lee Iacocca's triumph, proof that American industry could beat back the foreign invaders. The public face of the Pinto was one of freedom, affordability, and fun. It was the perfect first car for a teenager, the perfect second car for a young family. While Ford's profits soared and Iacocca's star ascended, the private atrocity was playing out, one random, fiery tragedy at a time, on highways and suburban streets across the country. The victims were invisible, their stories lost in the statistical noise of daily traffic accidents. They were people like Lily Gray. In May of 1972, she was driving her brand new Ford Pinto on a California freeway. A 13-year-old boy named Richard Grimshaw was her passenger. The car stalled in the middle lane. Moments later, it was struck from behind by another car traveling at approximately 30 miles per hour. It was not a high-speed crash by all rights. It should have been a survivable fender bender. But for the Pinto, it was a death sentence. Upon impact, the Pinto's rear end collapsed. The gas tank ruptured and the car exploded into a ball of fire. Lily Gray died in the inferno. Richard Grimshaw, by some miracle, survived. But he suffered devastating, disfiguring burns over 90% of his body. He would endure dozens of painful surgeries, his face and hands forever melted into a testament of Ford's $11 decision. His life and the lives of his family were irrevocably shattered. The Grimshaw case was not an anomaly. It was the blueprint. Across the country, similar stories were unfolding. In 1978, 3 teenage girls, Judy Ulrich, Lynn Ulrich, and Donna Ulrich, were driving in their 1973 Pinto in Indiana. They were stopped on the side of the road after being tapped from behind. A van whose driver was distracted slammed into the back of their stationary car. Once again, the Pinto erupted. The girls were trapped inside, all three, burned to death. The final official accounting of victims is a matter of debate, clouded by the difficulty of proving a fire was caused specifically by the design flaw. The most conservative estimates often cited by Ford place the number of deaths at 27. But subsequent investigations and victim advocacy groups have argued the true number is likely in the hundreds, with hundreds more suffering injuries as horrific as Richard Grimshaw's. For years, society looked away. These were individual tragedies reported in local papers as fiery crashes. There was no one connecting the dots. Police officers, firefighters, and even insurance adjusters saw the burned-out husks of Pintos, but they lacked the national perspective to see the pattern. It took a different kind of investigator to see the larger truth. The system that was supposed to protect the public, regulatory agencies, the press, the legal system, was slow to recognize the epidemic. For a crucial period, Ford's secret was safe, and the assembly lines kept running. The first cracks in the wall of silence came not from a government agency or a major newspaper, but from a small counterculture magazine. In 1977, a publication called Mother Jones assigned a reporter named Mark Dowie to look into rumors about unsafe cars. Dowie was not an automotive expert, but he was a dogged investigator. He received a tip from a disgruntled former Ford engineer, a man who could no longer live with the secret. This insider provided Dowie with the internal crash test reports, the photos of the burned prototypes, and the story of the ignored fixes. Simultaneously, another external pressure was building in the courtrooms. The family of Lily Gray and the catastrophically injured Richard Grimshaw were not content with an insurance payout. They sued the Ford Motor Company. Their legal team, through the process of discovery, began to unearth the same damning documents that Dowie was receiving. The civil lawsuits were forcing the company's secrets out of the locked filing cabinets and into the public record. The internal pressures at Ford were also mounting. The cost-benefit analysis had begun to backfire spectacularly. While the memo had projected small payouts for deaths and injuries, juries, when confronted with the evidence of Ford's callous disregard, were beginning to award massive punitive damages. The cost of fighting lawsuits and paying out multi-million-dollar verdicts was starting to rival the cost of the original $11 fix. The cold math was no longer working in Ford's favor. The wall of secrecy built to protect the company was now crumbling under its own weight. The breakthrough came in September of 1977. Mother Jones published Mark Dowie's explosive 14,000-word article titled Pinto Madness. It laid out the entire sordid history for the public to see. The rushed production schedule, the failed crash tests, the available cheap fixes that were rejected, and most damning of all, the cold, hard numbers of the cost-benefit memo. The article was a bombshell. It took a hidden, complex story of corporate malfeasance and made it devastatingly simple. Ford knew. They did the math. They chose to let people die. The public reaction was one of fury and revulsion. The Mother Jones story was picked up by major news outlets, including the popular television program 60 Minutes. The name Pinto was transformed overnight from a symbol of cheap, fun transportation into a national emblem of corporate evil. The car became a pariah on the roads, its drivers suddenly aware that the vehicle around them was a potential firebomb. The public outcry was deafening, and it was aimed directly at both Ford and the government agency that had failed to act. Under the glare of this intense public scrutiny, the NHTSA was finally forced into action. The agency officially opened an investigation it had slow-walked for years. Their own tests confirmed what Ford had known all along. The Pinto's fuel tank was unacceptably dangerous. In June of 1978, facing the certainty of a government-mandated recall, Ford preemptively voluntarily recalled 1.5 million Ford Pintos, along with the nearly identical Mercury Bobcat. It was one of the largest automotive recalls in history. The company that had refused to spend $11 per car to save lives was now forced to spend millions on a recall and suffer an incalculable blow to its reputation. The accounting of the horror was grim. Investigators and journalists pieced together the trail of bodies and burned-out cars. The internal memos, once secret, became star exhibits in courtrooms. Survivors like Richard Grimshaw became the human face of Ford's immoral calculation. His testimony and the sight of his scarred body was more powerful than any legal argument. In his civil suit, the jury was so outraged by Ford's conduct that they awarded him $2.5 million in compensatory damages and a staggering $125 million in punitive damages. The punitive award was later reduced by a judge to $3.5 million, but the message had been sent. A corporation could be punished not just for its negligence, but for its malice. The most dramatic reckoning, however, took place not in a civil court, but a criminal one. Following the deaths of the 3 Ulrich teenagers in Indiana, a local prosecutor took an unprecedented step. In 1978, a grand jury indicted the Ford Motor Company itself on 3 counts of reckless homicide. It was the first time in American history that a corporation was put on trial for murder. The case, State of Indiana versus Ford Motor Company, which began in 1980, was a landmark event. The prosecution argued that Ford had knowingly placed a dangerous product on the market, and that this conscious disregard for human life was equivalent to recklessness. They presented evidence of the crash tests and the company's awareness of the flaw. Ford, in its defense, assembled a high-powered legal team. They argued that the Pinto met all applicable federal safety standards at the time it was built. They argued it was no more dangerous than any other subcompact car of its era. They sought to disqualify the cost-benefit memo, claiming it was not about the Pinto specifically, but a general government submission. After a 10-week trial, the jury returned a verdict: not guilty. Ford had escaped a criminal conviction. For many, it felt like a profound failure of justice, proof that a corporation was too large, too powerful to be held accountable for the deaths it caused. But the trial itself had been a victory of sorts. It established a new precedent, a new weapon in the fight for corporate accountability. The mere fact that a corporation could be charged with homicide changed the legal and moral landscape forever. In the aftermath, the lives of the survivors and the families of the victims were changed forever. Richard Grimshaw became a reluctant symbol of the case, his life a continuous cycle of pain and medical procedures. He bore the physical and emotional scars of Ford's decision until his death. The families of the dead, like the Ulrichs, were left with a hollow legal victory in the civil courts, but the sting of the criminal acquittal. Their fight, however, helped to forge a new era of product liability law, empowering future victims to hold corporations accountable in ways that had been impossible before. The failures were numerous. The acquittal in the Indiana trial demonstrated the immense difficulty of proving criminal intent within a diffuse corporate structure. Ford's public relations machine worked for years to minimize the scandal, arguing that the Pinto madness story was overblown and that the car was fundamentally safe. They pointed to compliance with government standards as a shield, a defense that ignored the moral imperative to exceed those minimums when a known, fatal danger exists. The story of the Pinto is not just a story of corporate greed, but also one of systemic failure, of regulators who were too slow, a legal system ill-equipped to prosecute corporate entities, and a public that was unaware of the danger until it was too late. The cultural legacy of the Ford Pinto is complex. It became the butt of jokes in movies and late-night television, a shorthand for a badly made, exploding car. This dark humor, while a coping mechanism, also had the effect of trivializing the real human suffering involved. More importantly, the Pinto case became the foundational case study in business ethics courses around the world. Generations of business students have studied the Pinto memo and debated the line between profit and responsibility. It serves as a stark, enduring cautionary tale. So what have we learned? The Ford Pinto is no longer on the road, but the mentality that created it is not extinct. The pressure for profit, the race to market, the temptation to cut corners, these forces are more powerful than ever in a globalized economy. The story of the Pinto is a permanent reminder that spreadsheets do not have a soul. It is a warning that when human safety becomes a line item in a cost-benefit analysis, the calculation has already failed. The ultimate lesson is one of vigilance. It reminds us that the safety regulations we have today were often written in the blood of victims of past failures. It compels us to ask of every new product, every new technology, have you done the math? And if so, what value did you place on a human life? Remembering the Pinto is not about dwelling on a historical failure. It is about honoring the dead by demanding a better, more humane calculus from the living.